Okay, I am Laura Brady, for those of you who don't know. I am an ebook developer. I have a company called Brady Type, which I'm sunsetting actually, and taking a position at House of Anansi, in case you didn't know. Yeah, woo! I'm also the editor-in-chief of EPUB Secrets. I consult on workflow tools, specifications. I basically am a huge ebook busybody. And in my spare time, I help plan ebookcraft, and maybe some of you know I'm a big fan of the Blue Jays. I also definitely tweet too much. I am here this afternoon to talk with Ellen Ullman. I'm very excited about this. Ellen is the author of The Bug, a New York Times notable book and runner-up for the PEN Hemingway Award, and the cult classic memoir Close to the Machine, based on her years as a rare female computer programmer in the early years of the personal computer era. She lives in San Francisco. So it is a real pleasure to welcome you here to ebookcraft, Ellen. It is personally very satisfying to have you on our stage.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Grand. We're a little unique at ebookcraft. I think you've heard a little bit about us from dinner last night and from hanging out today, in that we are a tech conference that has equal numbers of men and women speaking, but also in that while the conference is centered around the technology of ebooks, there is a hardcore focus on artisanry and the craft behind that tech. So, you have written, what I hope is that those with knowledge of the humanities will break into the closed society where code gets written. It seems to me that the tension between coding and the nuances of UX is one that gets played out constantly in the work and in tech work in general, in our work and in tech work in general. Software and devices are imbued with the values of their creators, often creators who are blissfully unaware of or in complete denial of their bias. I have spent a lot of time recently leading workshops that attempt to get ebook developers to plan for accessibility and to understand the implicit ableist bias in their own sloppy code. How do you see the tech world bending to the demands for what I would call greater empathy or less bias in how they operate?
It's going to be a struggle, and there's a class and gender and culture war going on inside the tech world, which I think you've seen coming out of Uber or Facebook or Google or any of the other companies, and you don't hear about it in the smaller ones. So there is an insider culture that I worked in for many years. I love the work of programming. I love computing, but I had lots of not very nice things to say about the society of people who made the decisions inside that world. And people don't give up power easily. So for things to change, a battle is underway right now. And I think when someone stands up and says, Facebook, you have to change the way you are, don't wait around for that to happen. First of all, it takes them weeks to get up and say, oh, we'll try harder to be better. There is a kind of way in which that coding, technology, the tools to create computer code and systems works that has a sort of self-fulfilling aura about it. It is, the whole system is imbued with a set of values already. That to write code, you need to sit there and be obsessive, for days on end. That to be a good software engineer, as one who shall go unnamed, infamous former Google software engineer said, well, these women can't be any good at it because they won't stay and sleep under their desks at night. So
I love him.
Yeah. So you have to understand this is the culture that goes on inside there. And bringing in people who do not come directly out of the computer science schools into this environment is also a cause for attention. I know, particularly women, because they were the ones who've contacted me after the book came out, they say they go into meetings and they ask questions like, well, what's the social effect of this? Who is our intended user? Who is it that we're ignoring? Who are we underserving? Who are we overserving? Now, wouldn't it be good for us to explode? There are new markets out there of underserved people. They can't just all be poor, desperate people. There must be some advantage for us in this as a company. Now, look, these are money-making. We're not asking them to to function without making money, and they are ridiculed. Their response is, you know, that's not our job. Our job is to increase our user base. It has to be increased as if it was some kind of exponential curve that could never break. Venture capitalists are on them. The market is on them. So everything is invested in a certain, or invested, so to speak, in a certain direction to push technology where it is now. And so to get it to be more socially conscious as an area is going to take a lot of involvement of people outside of the technology world. And I think it's already happening. I think when this latest Facebook, you all know about Facebook and advanced analytics and let people shake their heads. You know, there's delete Facebook, you know, hashtag going around now. And now the question is this: can you ever really delete Facebook and function as an adult in today's developed world? Can Facebook really change? Now, I have a very sad thought about this, is that it's not clear that Facebook as people, as a company, really has much agency to change. Its business consists of algorithms that were written over years and that have gotten tweaked over years, but you can't just go in and say, okay, I'll just, you know, change these few lines of code here, and we'll have a much more trustworthy system that can't be hacked into. There was a limited amount that even the most well-meaning people at companies like Google and Facebook can do, given that they have this huge investment in a code base that is deeply algorithmic, and I think probably by now not well understood by the fourth wave of engineers who have come in before. So if there are people here who code, you know that you often come in, you look at the stuff that someone else did, and you go, you know, what were they thinking?
Because decisions are made in every step of that chain, and the algorithms reflect those biases that get layered on top of each other, and it just is a vicious circle.
What you said.
There's a practice in the ebook world to comment out your code. Mostly you're leaving notes for yourself because you'll never remember why you made those decisions that you did. I don't know how common that is in, like...
Well, it's common and not common. I mean, you kind of know, you know, you see the really generous programmers who came before you, because they're like, okay, this is really tricky because it has to do all this or this stuff, and it has to be really compact because we had to get it faster. And so they'll explain it to you. And then there were the ones who just, you know, on 2 pages of bit shifting, and you have no idea what's going on. I mean, you have to step through it in a debugger, practically, to understand what the code is doing. So it goes the gamut.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to skip ahead because it feels like I skip ahead in what I had planned. So most of the people in this room work in a legacy industry, book publishing, that is very slow to change. There is a lot of tension in that resistance to evolving. So I, for example, spend a lot of time arguing, tilting at windmills with the smell of paper book lovers and that kind of paper fetishist group of people. Do you have any comment or advice for people trying to bring about cultural shifts in their organizations, for example, like selling tech to the technophobes?
You're asking me for advice in marketing?
Well, mostly about how to, sometimes about how to shift our organizations or shift the people we work with to, in big and on small stages and big stages as well, like it.
No. No, I really, I'm one of the things I avoided in my life whenever I got into positions of you know, authority, you know, where I had to tell people what to do, or I got out of it as quickly as possible, because I really, I like to work in groups, and I like when people, you know, kind of follow the best idea, if possible. Mm-hmm. You kind of work it out to see the right direction is sometimes the one you take is sometimes the right direction, and you can backtrack. but when I have really no idea how someone drives an organization. There's a set of skills that I admire, but I have no idea how to do. I mean, I've been a software engineer and then a writer, so I sit alone a lot. And in terms of organizational development, I'm probably not the right person to ask.
Right. But there's so much tenacity in both of those, software engineers and writing. It requires a fair bit of stubbornness. So I read that you once spent about a year working on one bug, and I was thinking about that kind of stubbornness and tenacity. The constantly evolving nature of code is that it changes over time, responds to new conditions. In a way, publishing is quite the opposite. Produce one thing, put it out there, move on. In my work, for example, talking about ebook accessibility, it's very easy to make production managers cry, thinking about their backlist, which was converted under very different circumstances and sort of coding best practices. So then maybe we can talk about iterating on tech in maybe a tech-resistant industry or in your experience.
Well, see, my experience is different in that, aside from Close to the Machine, which came about because of the publisher at City Lights Books, if any of you are old enough to remember the Beat Poets and all of that, they approached me to write that book for various complicated personal reasons at the time. But after that, I was approached by Sean McDonald, who was my editor for The Bug and the novel By Blood and this. And he's completely into tech. I mean, he is always looking for ways to integrate technology into publishing, and he has his own imprint, so this is good news now. And so there are people out there who have been brought in later on who are already pushing for this change, because though we are happy that people still read books, they know that they have to reach people, not through traditional advertising. And once upon a time, as has happened to me, if you have a book on the front page of the New York Times Book Review or a mention of it, you'd have a bestseller. But unfortunately, that was way before my time. So they understand that to reach readers, they need to move into more digital marketing techniques. So they're open to this. But I do think it's a generational shift, and it's underway. It's inevitable, and it's already happening.
Okay. So I talked to you a little bit about this last night. A story that gets played out daily in many people's lives, but particularly in women's, is imposter syndrome. You talk about this a lot in both Life in Code and Closer to the Machine. So true to stereotype, I both procrastinated and then massively over-prepared for this interview. I was riveted by your writing about the anxiety of not knowing. You wrote that the corollary of constant change is ignorance. Especially in the early days of ebooks, it felt like change came so fast that there was never a static set of best practices. And I think we can say that now, although it is still constantly changing. And that not knowing gave so many of us stomach-wrenching anxiety almost constantly. So can you comment on managing imposter syndrome in tech-B work, particularly if you are new or a minority or from a non-programming background?
Well, in technology, there is no just knowing what you know and getting it over with. That's that. I mean, the pace of change, the change is constant, and the pace is steady or faster. It doesn't get slower ever. In my experience, as soon as you think you know something, it's old. And so anyone who works in technology has to be prepared to just face ignorance over and over and over. And it has to become part of your ability to just deal with failure. I mean, programmers, the art of programming is the art of typing out some stuff, which is called putting in bugs. And then the rest of it is taking the bugs out. That's, I mean, oh God, I wish I had a name. Anyway, the inventor of the Fortran programming language said that when they did it, they said what they figured out is they had to do it, and that failed. And they did an iteration, and that failed. And they did another and another, and they kept doing that over and over and over until something worked. And so that is pretty much the kind of work I'm used to. That You have to have a very high tolerance for failure, not only tolerance, but sort of find something in it that's really intriguing, like, oh, I'm going to get you. I'm going to find out what's wrong. And if you don't really have that, fire in the belly for that, like coding is not a good idea, or getting too close to the actual kind of coding or coding tools is not a good idea, because you're just going to want to kill yourself. So, so it's just something I think we all have to get used to in terms of how technology is changing. I mean, average citizen, how you start a car, how you operate a phone, how you look something up. I mean, there's no staying with any one thing we're doing anymore.
Right. It's like a new life skill, being able to deal with the not knowing.
Yeah, on the other hand, I always make myself feel better that I think all people in all time felt that their time was the most extraordinarily difficult one. So history tells me that everyone thinks they had it bad.
Yeah.
In terms of the imposter syndrome, yeah, I think women suffer from that more than men do. However, I mean, I have had colleagues come up to me and you start talking about it, you can't, and they say, you know what, I'm constantly afraid too. I'm aware of what I don't know. And that's, it's good when they let you know that, because then you feel you can just say, okay, I don't know a damn thing about this, and I don't know a damn thing about that. Let's exchange, damn things we don't know about. So, it is, I think, something women have more trouble with because the bar is set so much higher. Now, you work with anybody, you make a mistake, but in like say a code review cycle or a group of software engineers, anyone can make a mistake, and usually programmers pretty hard on each other, But when a woman makes a mistake, it's like she's stupid, all right? Doesn't the bitch know what she's doing? What is she doing here? It's just because she's a female, blah, 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 blah. So, you have to be a credit to your gender at every moment. And I think that's true for all minorities who show up in a place where they have to sort of prove that they're equal. And nobody needs to prove that they're equal, but somehow they have to anyway. And so this makes it seem like you have to fake it. You have to fake that you know what you're doing. But then again, if you really get to know people, most of the time people are faking it anyway. And
so comforting.
No, but faking it is, I once, actually, I wrote a piece, and I was talking to someone about how I'd never programmed a mainframe computer. And so there it was, a year or two into my programming in 1980, 81. I said, I won't be a real programmer till I programmed a mainframe. So I took a job completely bluffing my way in, and I had to fake it all the way through. And so I was talking to said, well, what do you mean fake it? Didn't you get everything to work? And I said, well, yeah. He said, well, you weren't faking it. You were learning. Well, I was learning undercover, But, I think once I kind of got a little older, I understood that everyone was afraid all the time. So you accept that everyone's afraid all the time. Life is easy.
I like that. Taking undercover too. I'm going to use that a lot.
I have many other cheerful things to say about that.
This is all super useful. I love all of that. I think it gets played out so often in everybody's lives. I think women suffer from it more, and other kinds of minorities. But so let's talk explicitly about gender in this tech world. I read Brotopia a few weeks ago. I don't know if anyone else has read it. The author, Emily Chang, wrote that in 1984, 40% of science grads were women. Today, it's more like 22%. So it sometimes feels to me, as I sort of look at the history of technology, that things were more fluid in the early days, like in the early 80s, say, and then got melded into a hard space with strong gender preconceptions and hardcore sexism. In Brotopia, the author quotes a transgender woman named Lydia Fernandez, who said, "I sat on both sides of this table. The game is rigged." I've read articles where you called it gladiator culture, the kind of gender issues that happen in tech. So then,
Well, that's the startup culture, is gladiator culture.
pardon?
That's the startup culture, is
Right.
gladiator
Right,
culture. So
right.
that's really like do or die. Okay.
And that is what Brotopia is about as well.
Oh,
yeah.
it is. Yeah, I
yeah.
haven't read it.
Yeah. So then I was wondering if you're hopeful about change in terms of that kind of, hardcore sexism, so stratified gender roles and that kind of, well, anyway, are you hopeful about change?
Well, it is my experience that when I first started doing it, there were far more jobs than anybody could ever
Right.
fill, especially since at that point computer science was a sub-branch of electrical engineering. So a lot of these electrical engineers were not going to go work, doing, I don't know, general ledgers, for some insurance company. So there were like lots of those sorts of jobs available, and anyone who knew what a compiler was, and I did, because I taught myself to program for reasons that are complicated and just stumbled into and thought it was fun, I got a job. And the people I worked with in those days were a very mixed group. They were former Sufi dancers, a French guy who refused to wear a white shirt and stop smoking Gauloise because he said a computer never complimented him or was worried about what it smelled like. People in library sciences, let's see, ABD in classical literature, an art historian.
It sounds fun.
It was. These were, we were all there because we were curious about this, or we needed a job, or both. And we were all kind of feeling our way through. And so it was work, all right? Work's work. But in many ways, it was a really fun time. And that, I think, I kind of used that as something that I held on to all the way through the tougher times that came. Yeah, right around the mid-'80s, the programmers I worked with came out of, they had degrees in computer science. And they were a very different group of, they were overwhelmingly male. This is stereotype, but it is my experience, not very communicative. Very little background in the humanities except what they had absolutely been forced to take. They were interesting. They were colleagues in their way, but there was just a limit to how much interaction that I could form with them. So it made debugging things very difficult, et cetera, et cetera. So things change. So it started out a whole bunch of people who didn't really know what they were doing. We thought, this is fun, let's find out. And then a whole bunch of people who came in and said they do know what's going on. They have degrees in computer science. And then we move on in time, and then how do we get people who don't know what they're doing back in the door?
The computer science grads sound much less fun.
Well, but that's changing. It is changing. We just have to trust that it will take some time. I mean, the young women. One of the really nice things about this book is that I got young women in fair numbers contacted me like, "Can you give me advice?" And I was like, "Oh God, no." But but they had a sense of hopefulness about this. And I said, look, first thing is find out, do you really love this stuff, right? I mean, there's no sense going to war and having your head bashed in if you don't think you really care about, if you don't like programming computer, there's no sense convincing yourself you do, Go off with a couple of your friends, do an online course, just do it together and see if it's fun. If it's not intriguing to you, if the sort of failure after failure I talked about doesn't have a sort of sense of intrigue in it for you, well then, this isn't for you, fine. There's no should for anyone to go into something. But if you give yourself a taste of it and find out you like it, well then, you can do this. I mean, there is a sort of sense in which, and I hate to say this, that it does take a deep internal struggle, and it did for me for several years, to just, I'm not saying suck it up, but you have to have some kind of inner resources where someone's going to give me a hell of a hard time, and I'm going to refuse to quit, because of that. I'm going to refuse to be sent out of the room, and that's all I can tell them. Is you're going to have your friends, you're going to have your colleagues. This is in the air now. This battle is in the air. But finally, there is that moment when you walk into a room, mostly guys, and they're doing some kind of meeting, and they're all talking over you, that you're just going to have to just, stick your courage to the sticking place. My God, I got my Shakespeare. That's embarrassing. But it's hard to say that to somebody because it's going to take a battle inside the companies, as going on now, outside in society, and inside the person. That's my phone. I can't believe it.
So happy it's not mine.
I can't believe I forgot to do this. All right, so I don't know who this is, but whoever it is, I'm very sorry. I hate anyone who does this, and now I hate me.
My husband texted me in the middle of a workshop recently looking for my son's jock and getting really mad that he didn't know where it was, and it came up on the screen. Hey, learn how to use Do Not Disturb, dummy, but also, come on, you know where I am.
That's good, though. I like that. That's very good.
He found it. It was probably where he left it, I'm just going to say. Anyway, I would love to open this up to the audience for questions. I think we could have a really interesting conversation with this group of techie people. Karen?
So I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate. I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying, and I'm trying to parse the difference between personality types who may be more aggressive, whether or not that's tied to more testosterone or not, number one. Number two, a culture, which is a more social issue. And number three, the financial pressures that public companies and startups are under, and how that is impacting people in tech. So those are three kinds of, I'm trying to parse out some of the things you're saying, but I'm pinging these different things as maybe some other sources besides a gender issue.
Oh, definitely, more than a gender issue. I mean,
Okay.
that is, part of it is the pressure everyone is under in these startups. But it does start way before the startup as to who gets funding. You see, at the very top of the food chain is the venture capitalists and the ones who give or seed money to whoever starts up a company. And so there's a tremendous amount of prejudice right there, right? In age and gender, age in particular. They want someone who's under 26 years old. Period. And the same thing in the hiring. It's overwhelmingly male, white and Asian, and young. Now, there are stories out there. I'll give you one. It appeared in Reuters, and I don't have the citation with me, but there was a company, a startup, in which the president said to the woman in charge of hiring, I want someone who's under 26 years old, 26 or under, for a vice president. And she replied, well, that's illegal. And he went, and turned away every single one who wasn't under 26 years old. So the age bias is ferocious. And so when you mix that with the gender, color, social class, you can see how many people are being excluded right off the bat. And that pressure starts from the top. I mean, who will get funded and who will not is fundamentally a social decision. And it's a decision as to who you trust with money and what kind of apps will make money. And who do you think your customer is, and so on. So yes, money, it's not as if money and gender and all of that don't mix. They're not separate issues. Um, Aggressive personality types, I wouldn't say, because programmers can be tremendously passive-aggressive people. Oh, would you take a look at that thing that went wrong? Uh-huh, yeah, right, I will. But can you say a little more about what was bothering you? Because I feel like I'm not tying it together.
I'm trying to understand more concretely what specific biases in the technology that you're seeing. So I understand social biases, I understand some of these things, but when you say there's a bias in the coding, what does that mean?
No, I'm saying, okay, I'd say you have an algorithm that is, what is the next hot trend? All right? Now, we've seen that. That's how we got fake news, trending. Okay, what is the new hot trend? Now, there is decision-making that goes into how you decide what the new hot trend is. And it's all in the code. It gets written, and a lot of hundreds and hundreds of lines of codes that get debugged and deployed. And then when you say you want to change the way you decide what's trending, in other words, now you want to see, gee, maybe it isn't just a million, fake news sources exchanging information with each other over and over. We want to see if it's actually good information. Well, to go back and change those algorithms is not an easy thing to do. It's like taking the eggs out of an omelet. It's all mixed up in there. So does that make it a little clearer?
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
So I was reading in, it was in Life in Code. There's a section, I don't know if you meant it to be funny, but I found it very funny because you described just being at a pub and just casually talking to Larry Page and Sergey Brin, as one does. And they're offering you a job, and then you kind of think for a moment and then decide that, you're self-taught and you've just started to look into this thing you're not really an expert in, saying, yeah, thanks, but no thanks. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that. And then also, in that passage, you don't necessarily describe that as a decision that had much to do with gender, and I'm wondering if you don't think of it that way, or you do and it just didn't write it as such.
Okay, so that took place at a beer and wine party for E-Groups, which is a startup from Carl Page, Larry's older brother. And he and I were friends. So this was in the run-up to the first crazy wave of the internet. And it was a small, pretty group of people. People kind of knew each other because it wasn't as spread out in this global sense as it was now. So for me to run into, I already met, knowing Larry, his family, so to run into them wasn't extraordinary. But so I was kind of in a bad mood because it was, forgive me, but a bunch of, young guys with beer bottles, and I'm looking around, any women I know here, is it any grown-ups here, and so then, I ran into them, and the background to this was that I had heard a talk by Lawrence Torvalds, who is credited with Linux. It's a long story about whether he deserved that or not, but it was about symmetrical multiprocessing, which is a way to have a computer with multiple chips and somehow keep them in sync. And I found the talk fascinating because it wasn't about this is the right way to do things. It was like, well, you could do this, but that would make that worse. Well, you can't test on that machine because that would give you false things. On the other hand, if you work with that machine, so it was all this engineering trade-off stuff, and gave me. I think everyone in the room had a sense of calm to recognize that computing wasn't about this perfection, but it was really about this sort of human trade-off as to how things really work. And so anyway, after that, I decided I'd teach myself symmetrical multiprocessing. Okay, people go to school for years for that. Why not? I can teach myself that. But then they asked me, what are you up to these days? And I said, no, I was doing some consulting. That was really boring. I decided not to talk about it. I said, well, I'm looking into, thinking about symmetrical multiprocessing. And their heads go like this. And they look at me and they go, you want a job? Now, symmetrical multiprocessing is all about what was making Google able to work so fast, right? Enabling search technology. And I just stood there for a moment thinking, on the one hand, gee, that would be great, you know? And then I went through, oh no, more boys with beer bottles for the rest of my life. No, that was consideration, honestly. And also, I don't know what the hell I'm doing. You know, they'll find out I'm a fraud immediately. And so I sort of ran away like a scared lizard up the wall, you know? And people have asked me later, do you regret, you know, not taking that job? Well, in terms of having $1 billion, yeah. But I think my life would have been so dramatically tense, and I would have been so fearful for so long that I don't know, I'm pretty sure saying no was the right thing.
The only other thing I'm curious is do you, and it's hard to imagine, you know, what would you have done if you were a man, because so much of your life would, I guess, be different. But do you think like a man in that same position would have that same feeling of doubt and say no?
Look, I can't speak for men, you know. Men have to tell me what they're like, you know. And I've really begun to stop talking about what men are like, because, you know, how can women deal with men? Well, men have to say how they can deal with women. You see how I'm just going to, but I don't know. I don't know. You can ask yourself, you know, you're a man, you know, you're involved in technology. What would you have done in that situation? Let's say you had absolutely no background, you had no degree in computer science, you had no or undergraduate degree in computer science, you had no background in one of the very, very difficult engineering tasks, and this involves chip design, part of it, and someone offers you a job in something you think is really interesting. Would you take it? You would.
So, I mean, if I were...
I'm talking about totally unprepared.
Yeah. So, I mean, the short answer is no, because I, like many other people, just wouldn't want to do something that I know I'm not going to do well. But I guess, and part of the reason that story is funny to me is because and I know that, like, what Google was very different then, and these were just kind of people you knew casually as opposed to some of the more powerful people on the planet. But I do just laugh at, like, I mean, I feel like if I were talking to them today and they offered me any sort of job, you know, it could be like, hey, would you be interested in killing dragons for us? And I'd be like, yeah, I can do that. So.
Well, it was different then, and it wasn't, yeah, you know, these days to get into Google, you have to like walk in cold and they'll give you a problem that, you know, they want you to stand up and code it right there, right in front. So, you know, I would never, ever want to go through anything like that. I mean, I have test anxiety, you know. I'll do it in the back room, but if you ask me to do it right, anyway, so just the way they hire predisposes that they will get a certain kind of person, right? Somebody who can just, has this, you know, walk up, deal with it, bang, 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 and who's not contemplative, who doesn't, you know, perform best when they have a chance to contemplate. Also, by the way, at these places, I mean, they have signs up there, you know, how many bugs you fixed, and I mean, it's a sweatshop. I mean, except at the very, very highest levels, those doing the deepest algorithms or the self-driving car stuff, it's a sweatshop. You know, I don't want to, it seems like a good place to work, but most coding places right now are there's so much code they have to write. It's fast, 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 fast. How many lines of code? How many bugs? How many lines of code? How many bugs did you fix? I mean, the more lines of code you write quickly, the more bugs you're going to have the more bugs you're going to have to fix. I mean, really, you just want to tell them, slow down. You write fewer lines of code, you take time, you'll have fewer bugs to fix. So, but this is not the way the profession works right now in the bigger companies. And people who come out of there, whom I talk to, are they don't know if emotionally they want to take this anymore as a way to live. You know?
So the thing that you're saying, you know, in that circumstance, I also would have said no thanks. In fact, I have said no thanks in less high profile but similar situations. But this is one of the things that I've had mentors who are trying to mentor me as a female programmer saying, hey, that's imposter syndrome. And sometimes what my mentors see as imposter syndrome, I see as actually a fairly accurate assessment of my own capabilities. But the thing that I find interesting, and this is a sort of a cultural divide in programming, which in my experience, Karen, I'm not going to make any general assessments about men and women, but in my experience correlate as a culture that goes along with women in tech versus a culture that goes along with men in tech. Women are more often to say, actually, you know what, I have an assessment of my own abilities and I think I can't do that. And the men are more likely to say, what? No, I know everything. I'll figure it out. No, I know it. What do you mean I figure it out? I already know it. And I find it weird because I also totally agree with what you said, that like programming is about failing. Like you write the bugs and then you fix them.
Right.
And so I find it weird, like if you go on an online conversation, a tech forum, Stack Overflow or something, it's everyone sort of, oh no, I never made any mistakes, you just misinterpreted me. And so I almost wonder, do you know of a way to have conversations between people who are like, oh no, see, what we're all doing here is we're all speaking accurately about what our limitations are, and people who are petrified that if they speak accurately about what their limitations are, people will find them to be failures?
Well, first of all, let me start by saying that I had a 22-year career as a software engineer, and I didn't know a thing when I walked in, except that I taught myself on a TRS-80, okay, using interpreted BASIC, okay? So I'm really was very open for many, many years to saying, yeah, sure, I'll figure it out, sure, right? I did. I mean, I operated that way for a long time, but I do feel that this really was something. Absolutely no, it was a very hard subject that I was not prepared for. So I think there is a difference between, this is accurate knowledge. So I think if you really know, I'm sure I could do it, but not in the cauldron of Google. Do you see what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
If I were going off in a room and taking a little while to say, okay, I'm going to try to get a job working with this stuff, and if I take some time, but actually being thrown into Google while teaching myself this, I don't know. I think I would have been too ashamed to admit any failures, and therefore I could not have succeeded, since succeeding means lots of failures in the way. So I don't know how to sort this out. Maybe it's true that women sense it more, but I didn't sense it for many years. I just want you to know, I want you to be proud of this woman who just went, I don't know what I'm talking about, but I'm sure I'll figure it out. But not in this one case. This one was really, really way above my head.
I want to thank you so much for bringing what you know and your generosity and your know-how. I loved hearing about your journey and reading about it, and thank you so much for coming to ebookcraft.
Thank you. Really been my pleasure. Thank you.